There is a pale, yellow-gray ceramic dust that costs exactly $14.60 a kilogram to synthesize. It holds the mechanical capacity to solve the impending global energy collapse permanently. And a $2.8 trillion petroleum refining cartel is spending hundreds of millions in dark money to ensure you never learn its name. Picture the intake manifold of a standard heavy-duty diesel engine. Now, physically strip out the traditional liquid fuel line. Rip it out entirely. Replace it with a porous, geometric honeycomb lattice coated in this exact ceramic dust. You expose this chamber to concentrated solar radiation, heating it to exactly 1,500 degrees Celsius. What happens next defies everything you were taught in high school chemistry. The ceramic literally breathes. As ambient atmospheric air flows through the honeycomb, the extreme heat causes the crystal structure of the dust to physically warp and expand. It creates a localized, microscopic vacuum that is violently hungry for oxygen. When the trace amounts of carbon dioxide in the air brush against the ceramic surface, the material physically rips the oxygen atoms away from the carbon. It shatters the molecular bond. It traps the oxygen within its own crystalline walls and spits out the remaining carbon monoxide, a perfectly pure, high-energy, combustible precursor gas. It builds fuel out of thin air, drop by drop. For pennies, no deep water drilling, no massive offshore rigs leaking crude into the ocean, no multi-billion-dollar pipelines carving through sovereign nations. Just raw atmospheric air, concentrated sunlight, and a highly specific localized thermochemical reaction. Done. Finished. A closed loop. The global extraction syndicate does not fear electric cars. They do not fear solar panels. They own the rare earth lithium mines, and they control the global supply chains for photovoltaic cells. What terrifies them, mathematically and existentially, is decentralization. The complete and total elimination of their geographic monopoly. Right now, the modern petroleum industry operates on a staggering 64% gross profit margin. This margin is derived exclusively from a singular, unavoidable fact. Crude oil is buried under very specific, highly guarded patches of dirt. If you want the energy trapped inside of it, you are forced to pay their extraction tolls, their maritime shipping tariffs, and their chemical refining premiums. Consider a standard ocean-faring crude tanker. It burns precisely 63,000 gallons of toxic, low-grade bunker fuel every single day just to transport raw sludge from a port in the Middle East to a processing refinery in Texas. The sheer kinetic inefficiency is staggering. They lose exactly 12.4% of the raw energy potential just in the transit phase alone. It is an archaic, brute force logistics chain designed for one single purpose: recurring revenue. They maintain a permanent stranglehold on human civilization because you are forced to purchase their liquid energy every single week. It is a mandatory subscription model for human survival. If you stop paying at the pump, your vehicle stops moving. Your winter heating shuts off. Your grocery store stops receiving food shipments. But if premium liquid fuel can be synthesized in your own backyard, pulled silently from the exact same air you exhale, the entire economic foundation of the 21st century collapses overnight. This is not a theoretical concept sketched in a science fiction novel. It is a heavily documented, empirically proven thermochemical anomaly utilizing a compound called Cerium-4 Oxide, and this single reaction mathematically neutralizes the $120 billion agricultural biofuel lobby. The exact same lobby that clear-cuts millions of acres of crucial farmland, completely drenching the topsoil in toxic synthetic fertilizers just to produce heavily subsidized, wildly inefficient corn ethanol. They require massive acreage. They require endless government subsidies to artificially lower their price per gallon. The ceramic anomaly requires nothing but a shoebox-sized reactor and a parabolic mirror. It is an economic slaughter. And that is exactly why the boardrooms in Houston and Riyadh have quietly declared a shadow war against this specific thermochemical loop. They understand perfectly well that if the public realizes liquid diesel can be extracted from the invisible air above their driveway, the geopolitical leverage of the entire global elite evaporates in an afternoon. Stay with me here, because understanding how this pale dust was originally weaponized requires looking past the slick propaganda of the modern green energy movement. It requires descending into the basement of a quiet metallurgical laboratory in Stuttgart, Germany, exactly 15 years ago, where a simple, undocumented heating mistake unlocked the chemical keys to the atmosphere. On the freezing evening of November 14, 2011, inside room 402 of a highly shielded metallurgical laboratory in Stuttgart, Germany, a routine calibration error accidentally tore a hole in modern thermodynamic theory. Two researchers were conducting a standard sintering trial on a batch of raw rare earth oxides, They were using a specialized high-vacuum induction furnace manufactured by Shimadzu, calibrated to pull a vacuum of exactly 10 to the minus 6 millibar. Their objective was pedestrian. They wanted to measure the thermal expansion coefficient of high-purity cerium dioxide pellets. But at exactly 9:42 p.m., a localized power surge bypassed the secondary fuse box, causing the furnace's tungsten heating elements to rapidly spike. The internal temperature overshot their maximum safety threshold by exactly 324 degrees, topping out at a blinding 1,524 degrees Celsius. The primary technician reached for the emergency cutoff switch. He was too late. Inside the quartz observation window, the pale ivory pellets did not melt. Instead, they underwent a violent, nonlinear phase transition. The intense thermal stress forced the cerium dioxide to physically shed its oxygen atoms into the vacuum chamber, instantly shifting its molecular state from a stable 4+ valence down to a highly volatile, oxygen-starved 3+ oxidation state. The powder turned a dark, gunmetal gray. It was an atomic structural anomaly known as a non-stoichiometric oxygen vacancy. To prevent an explosive thermal fracture of the quartz chamber, the automated safety system instantly flooded the furnace with a standard purge gas containing exactly 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Under any normal rules of metallurgy, the carbon dioxide should have acted as an inert cooling blanket. It did not. The moment the carbon dioxide molecules brushed against the gunmetal gray powder, the material reacted with a ferocity that stunned the laboratory staff. The mass spectrometer readings on the monitor bypassed the ceiling calibration limits. The starved cerium oxide was not merely cooling, it was hunting. Within exactly 1.8 seconds, the gray powder violently stripped the single oxygen atoms right out of the carbon dioxide gas stream, restoring its own crystal lattice back to its native ivory state. The gas exiting the exhaust valve was no longer carbon dioxide. The mass spectrometer read exactly 28 atomic mass units, pure, concentrated carbon monoxide gas. And here is the part that should make you stop everything. The researchers discovered that this process had zero chemical degradation, none. In traditional industrial chemistry, precious metal catalysts like platinum, rhodium, or palladium are extremely fragile. They suffer from a phenomenon called sintering. They break down after fewer than 3,000 thermal cycles because trace contaminants clog their active microscopic sites. They wear out. They cost millions to replace. But the cerium oxide powder did not possess standard catalytic sites. The reaction was occurring inside the absolute bulk of its molecular structure, utilizing the native geometry of its fluorite crystal lattice. It was acting like a flawless mechanical lung, expanding, inhaling oxygen from the air, contracting, exhaling it on command. The data was undeniable. The Stuttgart paper confirmed that the powder could repeat this atomic cycle over 50,000 times without losing even 0.01% of its operational efficiency. One breath, reset, done. They had accidentally discovered a material that could strip the primary industrial liability of the modern world and turn it into a high-octane combustible precursor using absolutely zero external electricity, just raw heat. The lab director immediately realized the terrifying geopolitical weight of the data sitting on his hard drive. If this laboratory anomaly was scaled into a commercial modular reactor, every factory, every smelting plant, and every residential home would become its own sovereign refinery. The data never made it to a public scientific journal. Within 48 hours of the experiment, the Stuttgart laboratory's digital server suffered an unprecedented, highly targeted external wipe. The physical logbooks were quietly classified under a restrictive European Union industrial security clause. Because less than 300 miles away, in a glass boardroom in Frankfurt, the executives of a dominant multinational energy distribution syndicate had just seen the preliminary mass spectrometer graphs. And their internal financial analysts had already calculated the exact mathematical cost of allowing this ceramic anomaly to leave the room. To understand why a major technology gets buried, you must follow the paper trail straight into the ledger books of the agricultural biofuel complex. This is a $120 billion syndicate that operates under the guise of green, sustainable progress while running one of the most resource-intensive land monopolies in human history. Look at the raw, unvarnished math of the modern ethanol lobby. Right now, under the strict guidelines of the Renewable Fuel Standard established by the Energy Policy Act of 2005, commercial fuel distributors are legally mandated to blend billions of gallons of corn-derived ethanol into the public gasoline supply every single year. This single piece of legislation creates an artificial, completely captive market. It forces the cultivation of over 92 million acres of prime domestic topsoil dedicated exclusively to growing fuel crops instead of food. But the kinetic efficiency of this entire industrial loop is a mathematical disaster. To synthesize just one single gallon of standard corn ethanol, the system must consume exactly 3.8 gallons of fresh water, 0.7 bushels of corn, and 28,000 British thermal units of fossil fuel energy just to power the high-heat distillation cookers. When you factor in the diesel required for the John Deere tractors, the heavy transport logistics, and the massive chemical processing plants, the net energy balance sits at a pathetic 1.3 to 1 ratio. It is a thermodynamic farce. It is an industry that barely breaks even on energy, yet yields catastrophic profits. The true product being manufactured here is not fuel, it is the federal subsidy. Between 1995 and 24, the federal government distributed precisely $47.8 billion in direct commodity subsidies to corn producers. This massive influx of capital artificially inflates the value of agricultural land, keeping thousands of family farms locked into a permanent cycle of debt-leveraged corporate inputs. They are forced to buy patented, genetically modified seeds, and they must purchase millions of metric tons of petroleum-based synthetic nitrogen fertilizers every single spring. Now, introduce the Stuttgart ceramic anomaly into this ecosystem. The cerium oxide solar reactor completely decouples liquid fuel synthesis from the surface of the earth. It requires 0 acres of arable topsoil. It requires 0 gallons of synthetic chemical fertilizer. It uses exactly 0 drops of fresh water. A single automated array of modular ceramic tubes, spanning the footprint of a standard suburban warehouse, can match the daily chemical fuel output of a 2,500-acre industrial corn monopoly. If this technology is allowed to scale, the financial implications are terrifying for the banking sector. If corn is no longer legally mandated as a mandatory gasoline additive, the baseline demand for commercial corn collapses by exactly 40% overnight. The value of agricultural land drops like a stone. The Tier 1 financial institutions holding over $450 billion in agricultural real estate loans suddenly find themselves holding completely toxic, unbacked debt assets. The enemy suppressing this science is not a cartoon villain hiding in a dark room. It is the cold, calculated risk management committee of a multinational investment bank protecting its loan portfolio. They do not care about alternative chemistry. They care about their terminal yield. And they will deploy every lobbyist, every regulatory loophole, and every corporate buyout clause at their disposal to ensure that energy remains bound to the dirt. Let that sink in, because the resistance to this ceramic dust is not a scientific debate over feasibility. It is a frantic, multi-billion-dollar defensive maneuver designed to protect a legacy asset class from absolute obsolescence. But to understand how the ceramic dust performs this miracle without using a single square inch of land, we have to look past the financial ledgers and zoom straight into the terrifying, violent micromechanics of the atomic grid itself. To truly understand how this pale dust achieves this molecular heist, we must look past the macroscopic scale and descend directly into the violent geometry of the cerium atomic grid. Under a high-resolution transmission electron microscope, a grain of Cerium-4 Oxide does not look like a random cluster of mineral dirt. It reveals itself as a highly ordered, hyper-precise cubical lattice known to materials science as a fluorite crystal structure. At room temperature, this structure is a perfect, rigid fortress. Every single cerium atom is locked in place, surrounded by precisely 8 oxygen atoms that act as electrostatic anchors. The balance is total, the chemical stability is absolute. This is why the material is traditionally used as an inert abrasive or a passive thermal barrier coat. It is designed to change nothing. But when you push this crystal fortress past the thermal tipping point of 1,427 degrees Celsius, the laws of standard molecular bonding begin to violently unravel. The intense thermal kinetic energy forces the oxygen atoms inside the lattice to vibrate with an aggressive, chaotic frequency. They start to slam against their atomic cages. As the heat climbs toward the target temperature of exactly 1,500 degrees, the electrostatic bonds anchoring the oxygen atoms begin to snap like over-tightened steel cables. The crystal lattice experiences a massive, non-destructive structural transformation. In any other material like iron oxide or silicon dioxide, this level of extreme oxygen loss would cause the entire atomic framework to instantly melt, fracture, or totally collapse into a useless pool of liquid slag. But cerium possesses a rare, highly specific quantum mechanical property that makes it an anomaly among the elements on the periodic table. It has a highly flexible inner electron shell configuration, specifically the 4f orbital subshell. As the oxygen atoms violently flee the lattice, escaping into the low-pressure reactor chamber as raw oxygen gas, the cerium atoms do not panic. Instead, they instantly absorb the stray electrons left behind by the departing oxygen. They change their valence state from a 4+ charge down to a 3+ charge. The entire crystal lattice swells, expanding its atomic volume by exactly 0.024 nanometers per unit cell. It creates a microscopic starving vacuum grid, a highly organized matrix of empty atomic pockets known as oxygen vacancies. The material is now an engineered chemical weapon waiting for a target. The target arrives the millisecond you introduce a stream of carbon dioxide gas into the chamber. At these ultra-high temperatures, the carbon dioxide molecule is already structurally weakened, its carbon-to-oxygen double bonds stretched to the absolute limit. The moment the carbon dioxide touches the surface of the starved cerium lattice, the oxygen vacancies act like an array of microscopic magnets. They do not gently bond with the gas. They violently rip one of the oxygen atoms straight off the carbon backbone. The theft occurs in less than 300 picoseconds. The empty pockets inside the cerium lattice are instantly filled, locking the stolen oxygen back into the crystal fortress. The cerium atoms surrender their excess electrons, snapping perfectly back from a 3+ charge to a 4+ charge. The lattice shrinks back to its original geometric dimensions. And the gas that bounces off the surface of the ceramic is no longer a stable, non-flammable pollutant. It has been stripped down to pure, highly reactive carbon monoxide. Stay with me here, because this is where the thermodynamic magic truly happens. This entire violent atomic heist takes place without a single external chemical additive. The cerium did not react with a secondary solvent. It did not consume itself. It did not degrade. It simply acted as a physical thermodynamic engine operating at a purely quantum level. It used raw solar heat to pump oxygen out of a carbon molecule, storing it temporarily inside its own atomic lungs, and then resetting itself to run the cycle again. The pure chemistry proves that human civilization has been lied to for a century. We have been told that converting carbon dioxide back into high-energy fuels is a thermodynamically impossible feat that requires massive, economically unviable amounts of electricity. The cerium lattice proves that it requires nothing but a specific atomic geometry and the raw, unmetered heat of the sun. But creating a high-energy precursor gas is only half the battle. To run a modern vehicle, you cannot pump raw carbon monoxide directly into a standard internal combustion engine. You need a liquid hydrocarbon. You need premium diesel. And to bridge that gap, we must look to a dark, highly classified historical precedent established during the height of the 1925 European industrial boom. So we have stripped the atmosphere of its oxygen. We hold a chamber full of highly reactive carbon monoxide, but you cannot pour a gas into the fuel tank of a heavy-duty freight truck. You need a dense, stable liquid hydrocarbon. You need premium diesel. And this is the part where the global petroleum syndicate's narrative entirely collapses. Because the technology to snap this exact gas into liquid diesel was not invented yesterday in a Silicon Valley startup. It was perfected exactly 101 years ago in a dimly lit laboratory at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Coal Research in Mülheim, Germany. The year was 1925. Two brilliant chemists, Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch, discovered a catalytic sequence that acts as a molecular sewing machine. It is a process that physically stitches invisible gas molecules together until they become so heavy they condense into liquid fuel. It is called the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, and it remains one of the most heavily guarded, quietly monopolized industrial secrets on Earth. Here is the exact mechanical sequence. You take the pure carbon monoxide gas generated by our cerium oxide solar reactor, you mix it with raw hydrogen gas, you pump this invisible vapor into a pressurized steel tube containing a highly specific porous catalyst, usually microscopic spheres of cobalt or iron doped with exactly 0.5% potassium to violently accelerate the reaction. You maintain a precise internal temperature of exactly 220 degrees Celsius and a pressure of precisely 25 standard atmospheres. Inside that steel tube, a brutal microscopic assembly line takes over. The carbon monoxide molecules violently crash into the surface of the cobalt catalyst. The catalyst acts like a chemical guillotine. It physically cleaves the carbon atom away from the oxygen atom. The stray oxygen instantly bonds with the hydrogen to form a single droplet of pure distilled water. But the carbon atoms are left stranded on the metal surface. They are highly reactive. They begin to aggressively bond with each other, linking up in a perfectly straight line, carbon after carbon after carbon. They form long, dense molecular chains. When the chain reaches a length of exactly 10 to 15 carbon atoms, it becomes too heavy to remain a gas. The physics of the molecule shift. It condenses. It falls out of the vapor stream. Liquid diesel fuel physically drips from the bottom of the reactor. Drop by drop, crystal clear, completely devoid of the toxic sulfur and heavy metal contaminants found in standard crude oil. It is a synthetic hydrocarbon so pure that it actually burns cleaner and cooler than the premium diesel currently sold at your local gas station. Carbon monoxide plus hydrogen yields liquid fuel and water. That is the equation. No drilling, no fracking, no million-barrel oceanic tanker spills. This process is not a theory. By 1944, a nation entirely cut off from global crude oil supplies used this exact chemical loop to synthesize exactly 124,000 barrels of liquid fuel every single day, keeping an entire mechanized army moving across Europe using nothing but synthesized hydrocarbons. And yet, when the war ended, this technology was deliberately and systematically erased from the commercial mainstream. Why? Because in the late 1940s, an absolute tsunami of dirt-cheap crude oil began flowing out of the newly tapped reserves in the Middle East. The massive multinational oil consortiums realized that if decentralized Fischer-Tropsch reactors were allowed to proliferate across the commercial sector, their geographic monopoly would be permanently broken. They deployed their vast financial leverage to quietly buy up the patent rights to the most efficient catalyst geometries. They funded massive, highly publicized academic studies specifically designed to frame synthetic fuel as an inefficient, hyper-expensive novelty. They mathematically rigged the economic models, ensuring that commercial banks would absolutely refuse to issue construction loans for modular synthetic fuel plants. They did not destroy the science. They simply locked it in an intellectual property vault and threw away the key, ensuring that the world remained utterly addicted to the pump. But the cerium oxide anomaly changes the math entirely. It provides the front half of the equation, the carbon monoxide, for practically zero marginal cost. When you pair the 1925 Fischer-Tropsch sewing machine with the 2011 cerium oxide lung, you have created a completely closed-loop, off-grid refinery. Which brings us directly to the modern-day institutional lockdown. Because the moment you try to build one of these machines today, you will trigger a silent, hyper-coordinated legal avalanche designed to bury you alive. So how exactly do you hide a completely closed-loop, off-grid refinery from 8 billion people? You do not send men in black suits to kick down laboratory doors in the middle of the night. That is Hollywood nonsense. In the real world, you weaponize the patent office. Let us track the precise legal mechanics of the modern institutional lockdown. If an independent mechanical engineer manages to replicate the Stuttgart cerium oxide thermal loop in their garage and attempts to patent a modular reactor design, they will immediately collide with United States Patent Classification 423, subclass 438. This is the Federal Registry for Solid-State Metal Oxide Thermochemical Reduction. Between 2012 and 2024, a labyrinth of offshore holding companies and anonymous private equity firms quietly purchased over 400 highly specific utility patents surrounding cerium lattice geometry and low-temperature Fischer-Tropsch catalyst doping. They did not buy these patents to build reactors. They bought them to create an impenetrable legal minefield. It is a corporate legal strategy known as catch and kill. The moment a hardware startup files a commercial intent to manufacture a cerium-based solar reactor, they are hit with an absolute avalanche of cease and desist orders. These come from elite litigation firms representing phantom corporations in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Defending a single patent infringement lawsuit in federal court costs an average of $3.2 million. The cartel files 5 of them simultaneously, in different jurisdictions. The startup bleeds out before they ever reach the discovery phase. Bankrupt, swept away, done. But what about the universities? Why aren't the brightest engineering minds at our elite institutions publishing open-source blueprints for these machines? Because the petroleum and agricultural biofuel cartels do not just own the patents, they own the academic endowments. In the fall of 2019, a promising thermochemical engineering team at a major Midwestern university was on the verge of publishing a breakthrough paper. They had successfully lowered the cerium oxide reduction temperature from 1,500 degrees down to a highly accessible 900 degrees using a proprietary trace metal doping technique. This would have allowed the reactor to run on standard, cheap, commercial parabolic mirrors you could buy at a hardware store. 3 weeks before publication, their $22.4 million federal grant was abruptly placed under an indefinite administrative review by the Department of Energy. Simultaneously, the university received a massive, unsolicited $60 million philanthropic donation from a Shell Foundation directly tied to a major Houston-based petrochemical refining conglomerate. The donation came with a strict, legally binding non-disclosure clause regarding all internal thermochemical research utilizing rare earth metal oxides. The cerium oxide paper was pulled from the journal. The lead researchers were quietly reassigned to dead-end, highly inefficient carbon capture projects that posed absolutely zero threat to the liquid fuel monopoly. The science was effectively buried alive, under a mountain of cash. The $2.8 trillion refining cartel and the $120 billion agricultural lobby do not fear the laws of thermodynamics. They control them. They understand that he who controls the fuel controls the civilization. They will happily allow you to buy an electric car because they own the lithium supply chain and they control the centralized power grid you plug it into. They will allow you to burn corn ethanol because it keeps you tied to a highly subsidized, easily manipulated agricultural matrix. But they will never, under any circumstances, allow you to synthesize your own premium diesel fuel from the invisible air flowing above your roof. Because the moment you break your reliance on their geographic monopolies, you do not just gain cheap energy, you bypass their metering systems, you sever their recurring revenue streams, you gain absolute, terrifying autonomy. And that is a reality the system simply cannot afford.